Welcome to EMDR Topics with Alice Strickland. I'm Alice Strickland, and today we're going to talk about what do you do when you're running out of time in your session and the client hasn't finished reprocessing. So in our previous video, we talked about how to fit an EMDR reprocessing session into 50 minutes. Today, we're going to talk about, well, what do you do if time's running out and they're not finished reprocessing? So if we go back and kind of watch that video, one of the things we talked about is structuring your session. And we talked about the 10-minute prep where you're checking in and you're establishing your goal, agreeing on the goal, and then doing your phase 3 by that 10-minute mark and moving right into phase 4. So the next piece we want to kind of pay attention to is if we're watching the clock, not kind of hypervigilantly, but as the therapist, we're just keeping an eye on the clock. And let's say we've started reprocessing at that 10-minute mark of the session. If by that 25 minutes, so that's 15 minutes into the session, 25 to 30 minutes, once they get to that 30-minute mark, if we know we've got about 10 minutes left in the session before I'm going to move to phase 7 closure. So right around that 30-minute mark is when I might start doing more interweaves if the client hasn't gotten there and moved kind of more into, like they've moved into desensitization and fully started desensitizing and reprocessing, then that might be where the therapist could step in and help out a little bit with some cognitive interweaves. I know in your basic training, because I'm a basic trainer and I do teach, that we try to stay out of the way as much as possible. And this is true. We want to let the client system do as much on its own organically as it can. However, we do have cognitive interweaves that we can use if we need them. And if a client seems to be like they're kind of moving along but at a slower pace, or again, you're running out of time in the session and they haven't gotten past a big piece of that memory, we could use a cognitive interweave just to help get them to that next step so that we've at least cleared out some channels before we move into closure. Now, I want to make sure I'm real clear. The expectation is not to finish a target memory in a 50-minute session. That's not the expectation. Does it happen? Yes. Can it happen? Yes. Does it happen all the time? No. Especially if you're working with complex trauma, it may take several sessions to clear a target memory. However, we do want to get some shifting that can happen in that 50 minutes. And so, especially if you're working with complex trauma, or if the client we're at that 30-minute mark in the session and we're still not seeing a shift that's happened of any kind, we want to use the cognitive interweaves so that we can get some desensitization happening in the session. So consider start using cognitive interweaves around that 30-minute mark just to help move it along in that last 10 minutes before you move then to the closure piece, which happens at the 40-minute mark where we go to phase 7 and close down the session. We will talk about in another episode of some specific ways that you may shift from EMDR to EMD if necessary and when to do that. But for today's purposes, consider using those cognitive interweaves.